Internal Revenue Service IRS Tax News. IRS reminds members of the U.S. Armed Forces of special tax breaks, helpful resources as the July 15th tax deadline approaches. Washington. The Internal Revenue Service today encouraged members of the military and their families to learn more about special tax benefits available to them as the July 15th tax filing season deadline approaches. So the tax filing deadline for 2019 tax returns, if you haven't filled out 2019, many have not because they extended the deadline from what is typically the deadline, April 15th or around April 15th for the prior year, meaning 2019 would normally be due on April 15th. It got extended out until July 15th, which of course is coming up quickly. So the IRS has been reminding people that the July 15th deadline is coming up quickly, and specifically members of the armed forces looking into resources for members of the armed forces. Remember that there are certain tax breaks for members of the armed force. So if you're doing your own tax preparation, you want to make sure that you're taking those into consideration as you prepare your tax return. Talk to people or resources that you have to make sure that you're filling out the tax forms properly. And when looking for someone else to help you with the tax preparation, you may want to make sure you're considering or looking into somebody that has experience with people that have military backgrounds possibly, because again, there are some things that are different, some benefits that might be there. And if you're dealing with someone that hasn't worked with military personnel as much, then they may not be as aware of them. So you want to have some idea of them yourself, talk to the resources that are available. And then when you do the tax preparation, think about having someone that has some background in that, or be able to prep them and let them know about some of these benefits that they could do further research on. Back to the text. Most military bases offer free tax preparation and filing assistance during the tax filing season. So there's a link to the free tax preparation here. I think this is a big benefit worth looking into because it's free for number one, for help with the tax preparation. And you would think then the people that would be participating here would be very familiar with some of the specific needs with regard to military personnel. Back to the text. Some also offer free tax help after July tax filing deadline. Some of these programs may be impacted by the current COVID-19, so it's best to check first. So you want to check the times that are typically going to be there and then see if it's affected by the COVID-19. I'm assuming the effect that might happen with the COVID-19 is that due to social distancing, they may not have as many of the in-person information there. So you want to make sure that it's still going on if you're going to look into that resource. Back to the text. Service members who prepare their own tax return qualify to e-file their federal return for free using IRS Free File if their income in 2019 was below $69,000. So there's a tool for the IRS that's going to be the Free File tool. So just a couple words of advice when you're thinking about how to prepare your taxes. You could use the Free File tool here, of course, which is nice. And it's on the IRS website. When you're thinking about using any tool, though, just make sure that it takes into consideration all your needs. And in case you have a state, obviously, if you have a state need for tax preparation too, you want to make sure that the tool that you are using, look into this tool and see if it's picking up the state as well. Easiest thing for tax preparation is to use software that can help you out with the Fed tax return, which of course the IRS is mainly focused on, as well as the state tax return. The federal tax returns are standardized for the entire country, therefore software can usually pick them up pretty easily. The states are going to be different from state to state, although they often will kind of feed off of the general outline of the federal tax return. The state tax returns are typically more difficult, therefore, because of the diversity of tax returns to prep, but software is getting better and better at it. So when you go to the IRS website, obviously you're looking at the federal side of things. The Fed and the state aren't talking to each other all the time, right? But the software tool that you're using hopefully can pick up the state and the Fed, pick up your needs for both the state tax preparation and the Fed tax preparation. Now, for 2019, you got to be below $69,000 to use this free filing tool. As your tax return gets more complicated, then you're probably going to want to look into maybe other software that could be help you out more, and or tax preparation help advice for both the tax preparation purposes and for advice for tax planning purposes into the future. Back to the text. All military members and some qualified veterans may use MilTax. There's a link to that here, a free tax service from the Department of Defense and military OneSource. So you could try that resource as well. MilTax. The IRS also offers free filing forms, which can be completed online and then filed electronically, regardless of income amount. So the free filing forms are typically going to be a little bit more detailed. You have to understand a little bit more about the taxes and or look into it, do the research more. All the tax forms as well as the instructions for the tax forms are on the IRS website, so you can look into that and think about how to fill out the fillable forms as well. Be aware that even most professional tax preparers, many people that prepare tax returns are basically reliant on software at this point to some degree or another, because of the complication with the tax return and also because it makes it a lot easier to do. So to actually fill out the forms, line by line, box by box, each form is a little bit more difficult than is normally done. However, because the tax software is going to help with that a lot. However, you can do that, and you can look at the instructions to do that. And if you do that, you really are getting a good understanding if you actually fill out the forms box by box, and the information is there to do that. But that would be a more difficult way to proceed in general. Take a little bit more research for that. Back to the text. Quote, military members serving our country at home and abroad earn the IRS highest appreciation and ongoing support, end quote, said IRS Commissioner Chuck Reddick. Quote, we have resources available at irs.gov that detail the special circumstances that can affect tax payment and return filing deadlines for military personnel and their families. We encourage them to visit our website. We are also very proud of the many veterans employed by and part of the IRS team. IRS Publication 3, Armed Forces Tax Guide, there's a link to that here, is a free booklet filled with valuable information and tips designed to help service members and their families take advantage of all the tax benefits allowed by law. Several key benefits are outlined below. So you want to get a link. There's a link to that here, the Publication 3, Armed Forces Tax Guide. So you want to probably get that and take a look at it. Make sure you're asking about those questions. Outline those questions. If you're talking to someone who has experience or you're talking to a tax preparation, then, outline what you might have questions about and then ask about them. Right? Back to the text. Combat pay. So there's a link to combat pay here. Is partially or fully tax-free. Service members serving in support of a combat zone or in a qualified hazardous duty area may also qualify for this exclusion. In addition, U.S. citizens or resident aliens, such as spouses that worked as contractors or employees of contractors supporting the U.S. Armed Forces in designated combat zones, may now qualify for the foreign earned income exclusion. So what you want to do is look into the combat pay. If you have combat pay, remember the general rule for the IRS when you're dealing with the IRS is your mindset is basically you want to look bad on the tax return, right? In other words, typically the goal is to make more money and look good. For taxes, of course, you want to look like you want to make less money, at least that are legally reportable, less money, and look bad because then you pay less taxes, right? So if you're talking about combat pay, then the benefit then from a tax perspective would be to have income that's not required by law to be reported on the tax return, which would then lower the tax calculation. And combat pay could fall into that. Then the IRS is saying, hey, there's income that has been earned there, but we're not requiring it to be earned income with or tax. It's not taxable income on the tax return. So typically, you would think then the documentation that you're going to be receiving in order to report the income that you have received, which would typically be like a W-2 from an employee, then hopefully will outline the combat pay and let the tax preparer know very clearly. In that case, you would think that whether the income is taxable or non-taxable based on the documentation that she received. So when you get the documentation, you want to basically be able to note that you can outline that. Now, the foreign earned income might be a little bit more difficult because if you have foreign income, then oftentimes the question is that you have double taxation on the income possibly, and there could be tax formats or tax law that's going to stop the double taxation. So if there was combat, let's read this again. if we had, in addition, U.S. citizens or resident aliens such as spouses that worked as contractors or employees of contractors supporting the U.S. Armed Forces in designated combat zones. So in that case, they may qualify for the foreign earned income exclusion. So if that's the case, if you fall into that category, again, you want to think about, well, is that being reported on the documentation that's reporting the income to you? And if it is, then you want to note that. If it's not, then you want to note, whether or not then the income that has been received is in qualification with this qualification, and if so, then you want to look into the foreign income exclusion, which could be a big benefit. Back to the text. Members of the military who serve or have served in a combat zone or in contingency operations outside the United States may qualify for an extension of at least 180 days to file and pay their taxes. So obviously the idea here would be that we don't want to penalize late payment penalties or late filing penalties for people that didn't file their taxes because they're fighting in a war or something right now. So you typically, if you're in a combat zone, you may be able to have an extension of time that's not typically there for normal citizens in that case. Back to the text. The earned income tax credit, there's a link to that here, is worth up to $6,660. Low and moderate income service members who receive non-taxable combat pay can use a special computation method that may boost the earned income tax credit, meaning they may owe less tax or get a larger refund. So the earned income tax credit is a tax credit that is partially refundable. So even if your income is fairly low, you may then get an earned income tax credit that is actually past the amount of your tax liability, meaning it's not really a refund, but more of a support program. And it may be boosted. That earned income credit calculation could possibly be boosted in certain cases if you're a member of the military. So once again, you want to keep that in mind when discussing that information with tax preparation, or when you're thinking about doing the tax preparation. You would think that the earned income credit can be a little bit complicated of a credit. You would think smaller or tax returns with less income would be easier to do, and they are for the most part. But there's a couple credits that are these refundable credits that can be a little bit complicated. So the earned income credit is probably the most complicated of them, as well as the child tax credit. So you want to make sure that you're picking those up correctly, because once again, you could get a refund worth more than the amount that was withheld, because some of that earned income credit and the child tax credit could be refundable, and that's what the refundable portion means. And let me just kind of outline the problem of why this might happen with the earned income credit a little bit, or my understanding of it. Notice the earned income credit is designed to help people to say that if you have some earned income, then you'll actually get more of a credit if you have earned income. So if you had no earned income, then you wouldn't get the credit, but so it's trying to incentivize people to work. So then if you have some earned income, then you're more likely the credit will go up to some point in time until your earned income goes over a certain limit. Then the earned income credit will go down and eventually down to zero. So it actually goes up as your earned income goes up, because it's trying to incentivize work, right? It doesn't want to disincentivize work. So that's the idea of the earned income credit. But then you have this situation where members of the military might have non-taxable combat pay. Well, if you had non-taxable combat pay, then that could actually hurt you with regards to the earned income credit, because now you want the earned income, because to some degree the earned income would be increasing your earned income credit up to a certain level. And if you say it's not taxable and it's not in effect for the earned income credit, then it could actually hurt the military personnel with regards to the earned income credit. And that's not the intention of the thing. So then you would think basically, well, even though it's not taxable income for taxes, then maybe we should be recording it or putting it into the calculation for the earned income credit, so that the earned income credit will be improved. So basically, the idea there, to my understanding of it, would be that we want to get we want the best of both worlds. We want it to be non-taxable, and we want it to be able to benefit the calculation for the earned income credit to the maximum point that it could. Okay, back to the text. A service member and their spouse can each choose to have their non-taxable combat pay included in their earned income for purposes of the earned income tax credit. So like that's the key here. So why would you do that? because the earned income credit actually goes up when you have when your income goes up to a certain point. So you get the option to max that out. So again, be aware of that when you're talking to, if that's affecting you, to a tax preparation, so that they can take that into consideration, make sure they're calculating that earned income. Most tax preparers are going to be pretty much dependent on their software to calculate the earned income credit. So you want to make sure they're double checking that, in that instance. So back to the text. Service members are encouraged to select the option that best benefits them. Those who served in the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt may qualify for combat zone tax benefits retroactive to June 2015. Under the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA, members of the U.S. Army, U.S. Navy, U.S. Marines, U.S. Air Forces, and U.S. Coast Guard who performed services in the Sinai Peninsula can now claim combat zone tax benefits. There's a link to now claim combat zone tax benefits here if you want more information on that. I apologize for completely not pronouncing that name correctly. Back to the text. Dependent care, there's a link to dependent care here. Assistance programs for military personnel, there's a link to military personnel here, are excludable benefits and not included in the military member's income. So if you have dependent care assistance programs for military personnel, are excludable benefits and not included in the military member's income. So in other words, if you get dependent care benefits, you would think that you would be receiving benefits for dependent care in that case. Normally, you would think, okay, that's a form of compensation, even though it's not cash. Therefore, you would think it would be included in income and be something that would be taxable. In this case, they're saying no. This should be, again, something that when you get the documentation, that would be like a W-2 for an employee. When you get the documentation reporting your income, hopefully that documentation is reporting that, breaking it out of the taxable, portion and showing the dependent care not as a taxable portion on the documentation that you would be receiving, that would be reflecting your taxable income. So hopefully that one's going to be straightforward and is on the people that are reporting your income to you to fill out the documentation correctly there. But it's something that you want to double check on. If you're getting the dependent care, make sure that when you get the documentation, it's being reported not as taxable income, but as non-taxable income, and make sure that's clear, so that when your tax preparation person puts it out, then it should be straightforward if the documentation is breaking that out nicely. So back to the text. The moving expenses deduction is suspended in tax years 2018 through 2025, except for certain service members. So there was a moving expense deduction before, and they basically changed that. They changed it. They limited it down. They basically removed it, except for certain service members. So if you're talking to a tax professional and you have this moving expense, they might say, well, that's gone now. But then you're like, well, I'm a military professional. and then it might still be there, right? Because that's going to be like the one exception to the removal of that law that was in there before. So back to the text. Active duty service members who move pursuant to a permanent change of station or order may still claim this deduction. So in other words, it used to be a deduction for if you change jobs over a certain location, or, and the move, you had a deduction for the move, and then they took that away, but they left it on there for military personnel. So keep that in mind if you had a move. Also, service members who move due to permanent change of station order may exclude from tax any moving reimbursement they receive. And that's probably more likely the case, because what happens if you move, if you get relocated or something in the military, it's quite likely that the military will either pay you for the move or possibly reimburse you maybe for the move. Now, if they reimburse you for the move, then you can't really record a deduction for the expense because you didn't have an expense. They reimbursed you. However, you typically shouldn't need to record then the reimbursement that they gave you for the move as taxable income, because it was given to you for the expenses related to moving. So normally I would suspect that the normal situation that would happen here is you're not going to have a deduction for the moving expense. You'll have the moving expense, the military will reimburse you, and then you want to make sure, this is my my interpretation of what I would expect would be normally happening. And then the military would reimburse you, and then you just want to make sure that the military, when they reimburse you, they didn't record it as taxable income. Once again, on the report that would be showing you the taxable income that you would be given to your tax preparation or doing yourself, you want to make sure that the reimbursement is reported either separately as non-taxable, or may not be included in that documentation. And therefore, it should be pretty straightforward for the tax professional in that case, because it wouldn't be whoever gives you the information based on this moving reimbursement just shouldn't be reporting it as taxable income in the documentation they're giving you, that the tax preparer is going to then use to prepare the tax return. And if that's the case, then it should be pretty straightforward. You just want to make sure that that is indeed the case. Back to the text. The spouses normally must sign a joint income tax return, but if one spouse is absent due to certain military duty or conditions, the other spouse may be able to sign for him or her. A power of attorney, there's a link to the power of attorney here, is required in other instances. A military installations legal office may be able to help. So if one person isn't there to sign for certain circumstances, you may be able to have one spouse sign the tax return. That's usually required to be signed by both spouses, and usually to be able to sign for somebody else, you need a power of attorney, which basically allows somebody to act as an agent to basically sign for them. So if in that case, if you can get a power of attorney, then that would be a workaround possibly as well. So the IRS has a special page on irs.gov, the tax information for members of the U.S. Armed Forces. There's a link to that here, and there'll be a link to this in the description.